It is often hard to imagine what life is like for someone who is recognized by millions of people everywhere they go. For Keanu Reeves, the roar of a motorcycle engine and the wind rushing past his face became the only way to find silence. To the world, he was a massive movie star, a face on a poster in every theater. But in his own mind, when he was on two wheels, he was just another guy on the road, invisible and free. He didn't ride for the image or the fame. He rode because he loved the feeling of the machine beneath him, the way a bike responds to the body, and the focus required to keep the rubber on the road. It was a passion that started long before the bright lights of Hollywood and remained the one thing that kept him grounded. No matter how famous he became, however, being a serious rider is very different from just being a fan of motorcycles. Keanu didn't just like looking at them parked in a garage. He rode them hard. He spent countless hours winding through the canyons of California, pushing himself and his bike to the limit. Over the years, he owned many different kinds of machines. Some were fast, Italian racing bikes built for speed, while others were heavy, American cruisers built for style. He loved them all, but he began to feel that something was missing. It seemed like the motorcycle world was divided into two camps. You had the sleek, plastic-covered sport bikes that were uncomfortable to ride for long distances. And you had the big, loud custom bikes that looked amazing but handled poorly around corners. Keanu wanted something that didn't really exist yet. He wanted a bike that looked cool and had a classic style, but one that could also move like a modern performance machine. He didn't want a garage ornament. He wanted a beast that could come alive when he twisted the throttle. This frustration grew over time. He would modify his own bikes, trying to fix the suspension or change the handlebars to make them more comfortable, but it always felt like he was putting a bandage on a deeper problem. He realized that if he wanted the perfect bike, he couldn't just buy it off a showroom floor. He was going to have to find someone who could build it from scratch. This search wasn't as easy as it sounds. The motorcycle industry is huge, but true craftsmen are rare. Keanu didn't want a big corporation to build him a bike. He wanted an artist. He wanted someone who understood the metal and the engine the way a writer understands words. He spent months looking, talking to mechanics, and visiting shops, but he always left feeling disappointed. Most builders just wanted to copy what everyone else was doing, or they didn't want to listen to his specific ideas. They saw him as a celebrity customer, not as a serious writer. Then he heard about a man named Gard Hollinger. Gard wasn't a famous name in the movie business. He was a metal fabricator and a custom bike builder based in Venice, California. His shop, called Gard Hollinger's Chopper, was a gritty, no-nonsense workspace tucked away in an industrial area. It wasn't a polished showroom with fancy lights and coffee machines. It was a place filled with sparks, welding torches, and the smell of oil and gasoline. Gard was known for being incredibly talented, but also for having a very strong personality. He was a perfectionist who didn't compromise on his work. And he didn't care who you were if you didn't know bikes. He didn't have much time for you. One afternoon, Keanu decided to visit the shop. He didn't arrive with an entourage of bodyguards or a fleet of black SUVs. He pulled up on his motorcycle, dressed in a helmet and riding gear, just like any other customer walking in off the street. When he walked through the door, the atmosphere was tense. The guys working in the shop looked up, surprised to see the famous actor standing there in their grease-filled workspace. But Keanu didn't act like a star. He took off his helmet, looked around with genuine curiosity, and smiled. He found Gard working on a frame in the back of the shop. Gard didn't roll out the red carpet. He didn't ask for an autograph. He simply wiped his hands on a rag and looked at Keanu, waiting to hear what he wanted. This lack of pretense immediately impressed Keanu. He could tell that Gard was the real deal. Keanu explained that he had been writing for years and that he was looking for someone to help him with a project. He told Gard about his frustrations with the bikes he owned. He spoke about the vibration, the uncomfortable seats, and the way the suspension felt like it was fighting against him. Most builders would have just nodded and promised to build whatever the rich actor wanted, but Gard listened differently. He listened to the technical details. He understood the engineering problems Keanu was describing. However, Gard was a man who took pride in his own designs. He wasn't a hired gun who just followed orders. He was an artist. As the conversation went on, it became clear that Keanu wasn't just asking for a simple paint job or a new exhaust pipe. He wanted to change the very soul of the machine. Guard was skeptical. He had worked for celebrities before, and often they wanted things that were flashy, but didn't make sense mechanically. He looked Keanu in the eye and challenged him on his ideas. He argued that some of the things Keanu wanted to do wouldn't work or would ruin the look of the bike. Instead of getting offended, Keanu lit up. He loved the debate. He pulled out his phone or pointed at parts in the shop, explaining exactly why he thought a certain change would improve the handling. He wasn't talking about looking cool. He was talking about physics and geometry. This was the moment the dynamic shifted. Guard realized that this wasn't a bored actor looking for a new toy. This was a fellow enthusiast who spent way too much time thinking about motorcycles. The two of them stood there in the noise of the shop, talking late into the afternoon about suspension, travel, rake angles, and the weight of the metal. The walls between the movie star and the mechanic began to crumble. They were just two guys obsessed with the same problem. Keanu had brought his current bike to the shop to show Guard what he was working with. It was a custom machine that he had already spent a lot of money on, but he still wasn't happy with it. He pointed out specific parts that felt dead or heavy. He explained that when he leaned into a turn, the bike didn't communicate with him. It felt sluggish. Guard looked over the bike, nodding slowly. He could see exactly what Keanu meant. The work done on it was good, but it wasn't great. It lacked a singular vision. After looking everything over, Guard crossed his arms. He told Keanu that fixing this specific bike piece by piece was a waste of time. He said, "If you want a bike that actually does what you're talking about, we aren't going to fix this one. We have to throw it in the garbage and start over." It was a bold statement. Keanu had spent a fortune on the bike he brought in. But deep down, he knew Guard was right. He had been trying to force a square peg into a round hole. He realized that the small annoyances he had been feeling for years, the vibration, the poor handling, the discomfort were all symptoms of a machine that wasn't built with his specific philosophy in mind. As the sun began to set outside the shop, casting long shadows across the garage floor, Keanu made a decision. He wasn't just going to buy a service from Guard. He was going to partner with him. He didn't want to just write a check and come back in 6 months. He wanted to be involved. He wanted to understand how to build the bike. He asked Guard if he would be willing to build a prototype, a concept bike that combined Keanu's ideas with Guard's craftsmanship. Guard hesitated. Building a one-off custom bike from scratch is a massive undertaking. It takes thousands of hours and costs a huge amount of money. But looking at Keanu's intense focus, Guard saw an opportunity to do something special. He agreed to take on the project, but he warned Keanu that it was going to be hard work. They shook hands on it right there in the shop. It was a simple handshake, but it marked the beginning of a journey that neither of them could have predicted. What started as a customer walking into a shop to fix a wobbly handlebar was slowly turning into something much bigger. Keanu walked out of the shop that evening with a sense of excitement he hadn't felt in a long time. He was still one of the most famous actors on the planet, but he had just found a new purpose that had nothing to do with movies. He had found a problem that needed solving, a challenge that required his hands and his mind, not just his face. As he put his helmet back on and kick-started his engine to ride home, the noise of the city seemed to fade away. His mind was racing with ideas, drawings of frames, and the sound of welding torches. He didn't know it yet, but this simple meeting was about to change the entire direction of his life. The observation he had made that bikes could be better than they were was about to become his reality. He wasn't just a writer anymore. He was about to become a creator. And it all started in a small, greasy shop in Venice, with two men talking about metal. The days that followed that first meeting were not filled with red carpets or Hollywood premieres. Instead, they were filled with the smell of sawdust, the screech of metal on metal, and the constant, humbling buzz of grinders. Guard Hollinger's shop was a world away from a movie set. It was a place of hard work and dirty hands. When Keanu Reeves started showing up there every day, the atmosphere was strange at first. The mechanics working for Guard were used to seeing celebrities in magazines, not standing next to them in greasy coveralls. But Keanu didn't act like he was above anyone. He would arrive early in the morning, often with coffee in hand, and just get to work. At the beginning, it was unclear what exactly Keanu's role was supposed to be. He wasn't a trained fabricator. He didn't know how to weld aluminum or shape a gas tank with an English wheel. But he had something else that was just as valuable, a brutally honest perspective. He was the ultimate critic because he was the customer who intended to actually use the product in the real world, not just polish it in a garage. While Guard focused on how the bike looked, making sure every line was perfect and every weld was invisible, Keanu was obsessed with how the bike felt. Weeks went by and the project moved slowly. Guard was building the frame of the bike from scratch. It was a complex process of measuring, cutting, and fitting pieces of metal together to create the skeleton of the machine. Guard was an artist, and like many artists, he had a specific vision. He had been building custom bikes for a long time, and he trusted his gut. He knew what looked cool. There was a certain way things were done in the custom bike world, and Guard was a master of that style. One afternoon, the sun was beating down on the roof of the shop, making the air inside hot and heavy. Guard was working on the rear end of the bike. He had just finished installing a custom sissy bar and a rear fender strut assembly. For those who don't know motorcycles well, this is the structure at the back of the bike that holds the seat and the fender in place. In the custom world, this part is often beefy, thick, and decorative. It's a place where builders show off their skills with fancy curves, and heavy metal. Guard stepped back, wiping sweat from his forehead, and admired his work. It looked strong. It looked masculine. It fit the aesthetic of the bad boy bike they were trying to build. He figured Keanu would love it. It was exactly the kind of detail that people pay big money for. Keanu walked over to the bike, his eyes scanning the frame. He didn't say anything at first. He ran his hand along the metal tubing, feeling the texture and the weight. He walked around to the back of the bike and crouched down. He stared at the sissy bar and the struts that connected the rear fender to the frame. He furrowed his brow. It was a look of concentration, not anger. What do you think? Guard asked, expecting a compliment. It's solid, right? It looks tough. Keanu stood up and put his hands on his hips. He looked at Guard, then back at the metal. He pointed to the rear structure. It's too heavy, he said. His voice was quiet but firm. Heavy? It's steel, Keanu. It's supposed to be heavy. Guard laughed, thinking he was joking. That's what gives it that classic look. That weight is what makes it a real machine. Keanu shook his head. I know it's steel. But look at the leverage. The way this bar is angled, and the thickness of that strut. It's putting too much weight too high up. When I'm riding, and I hit a bump, or I'm coming out of a turn hard, that weight is going to push me around. It's dead weight. Guard's smile faded a little. He didn't like being told his artistic choice was wrong. Look, he said, his tone getting defensive. This is how these bikes are built. You want that rigid, hardtail look? This is the geometry that goes with it. You can't have the look without the weight. That's just physics. This was the moment. It was the small observation that would change everything. Most customers would have just nodded and agreed because they didn't want to offend the builder. Or they didn't know enough to argue. But Keanu didn't back down. He wasn't trying to be difficult. He was trying to solve a problem he had felt on the road for years. No, it's not just physics, Keanu said. He walked over to a whiteboard nearby and picked up a marker. He wasn't a scientist, but he had spent thousands of hours thinking about movement. He started drawing a simple diagram of the bike. Look, if we shave this down here, and we change the angle of the support by maybe 5 or 10 degrees, we can move the center of gravity lower. We can use a thinner gauge of steel, but brace it differently. It will look just as good, but it won't fight me when I ride. Guard looked at the drawing. Then he looked back at the bike. In his head, he was already dismissing it. This guy is an actor, he thought. What does he know about metallurgy? Guard was the professional. He had spent years learning his craft. He felt a surge of annoyance. He didn't want to redesign the back half of the bike just because the customer had a hunch. Keanu, Guard said, trying to be patient. I've built a lot of bikes. None of them have fallen apart. If we change that angle, you're going to mess up the line of the seat. It's going to look weird. Trust me, I know what I'm doing. It's not about falling apart, Guard, it's about performance, Keanu replied. He walked over to the bike again and grabbed the sissy bar. Imagine this bike doing 80 miles an hour on a highway. The wind hits this big flat surface here. It creates drag. It lifts the front wheel slightly. It makes the steering vague. I don't want vague. I want precision. The shop went quiet for a moment. The other mechanics stopped working to watch the standoff. It was a classic clash of egos, but it was also a clash of philosophies. Guard was building a statue. Keanu wanted to build an instrument. Keanu took a breath. He realized he wasn't explaining it right. It wasn't about the technical specs. It was about the feeling. Look, he said softly. When I'm on the bike, I want to feel like the bike is an extension of my body. If the back end is heavy and dead, it's like wearing a backpack full of rocks. I want it to feel light. I want to turn my thoughts and have the bike turn. This part here, it's a wall. I want it to be a bridge. Guard stared at him. He saw the sincerity in Keanu's eyes. This wasn't a diva tantrum. Keanu wasn't asking for a bigger trailer or a different kind of sparkling water. He was asking for the bike to be alive. Guard sighed. He was tired, the shop was hot, and the actor was persistent. Okay, Guard grumbled. You think you can make it look right by changing the angle? I don't think I can, Keanu said. I know if we work it out, the bike will be better. Guard threw his hands up. Fine, let's try it your way. But if it looks ugly, I'm taking it off. For the next few hours, they worked on that specific part of the bike. It was a tiny detail in the grand scheme of things, a few inches of metal tubing, but they treated it like open-heart surgery. Guard held the torch while Keanu offered suggestions on the angle. They shaved off the excess bulk. They bent the metal into a curve that was more subtle, more streamlined. It wasn't as flashy as the original design. It was quieter. It was more refined. When they were done, the difference wasn't shocking to the eye. If you looked at the bike, it didn't look like they had changed much. But Keanu was smiling. You see that? Keanu pointed at the new lines. The weight is tucked in now. It follows the line of the engine. Guard looked at it. He had to admit the flow was better. It looked less like a monster truck and more like a fighter jet. But he still wasn't convinced about the ride. We'll see, he muttered. A few days later, the frame was ready for a test ride. The engine was dropped in, the wheels were on, and the basic controls were hooked up. It wasn't a finished bike yet. It still had wires hanging out and no paint, but it was rideable. Guard was the first to take it out. He wanted to check for leaks and make sure the engine ran right. He rode around the block, came back, and said it felt fine. It runs, Guard said. Good job? Then Keanu put on his helmet. He swung his leg over the bike. Guard watched him closely. Keanu didn't just sit on the bike. He melted into it. He adjusted the mirrors, checked the clutch, and took a deep breath. He kicked the starter, and the engine roared to life, a deep, thundering sound that shook the tools on the workbenches. Keanu rode out of the shop and turned onto the street. He was gone for about 20 minutes. When he came back, he wasn't just riding normally. He came in fast, taking the corner into the driveway with a lean that would have made a lesser rider crash. He skidded to a stop right in front of the shop door, the front of the bike bobbing up and down as he grabbed the brakes. He killed the engine and pulled off his helmet. He was grinning from ear to ear. What did I tell you? Keanu asked, breathing hard from the adrenaline. The back end. It follows me now. Before, it was like I was dragging an anchor. Now it just floats. Guard walked over to the bike. He looked at the exhaust pipes, which were glowing hot from the ride. He looked at the tire marks on the concrete. He knew Keanu wasn't lying about how it felt, but he wanted to feel it for himself. Let me take it back out, Guard said. Keanu tossed him the helmet. Guard geared up and took the bike out. This time, he didn't just ride around the block. He took it to the freeway. He opened it up. He pushed it into a few corners. And there it was. He could feel the difference. The bike didn't wallow. It didn't feel heavy in the rear. The steering was sharper, more responsive. It was subtle, but it was there. That small change in the angle of the tubing, the silence that settled over the shop after that test ride was not an awkward silence. It was the kind of heavy, thoughtful quiet that happens when people realize they have just stumbled onto something important. Guard Hollinger stood there, looking at the motorcycle they had just modified. In his mind, he was taking it apart, piece by piece, analyzing every bolt, every weld, and every angle. He knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that they couldn't stop there if changing the angle of the sissy bar and shaving off some weight made that much of a difference to the handling. Then the rest of the bike was essentially wrong. The engine mounts were wrong. The way the gas tank sat on the frame was wrong. The fork angles were wrong. The bike Keanu had brought him was a beautiful machine, but compared to what it could be, it was a dinosaur. Guard let out a long sigh and walked over to his workbench. He grabbed a rag and wiped the grease off his hands, trying to find the right way to say what he was thinking. He didn't want to discourage Keanu, but he also knew the reality of running a business. Custom bike building is a game of hours and dollars. You can only spend so much time on one project before you start losing money. Because there are only so many hours in the day and only so much a customer is willing to pay. Listen, Guard started, turning to face Keanu. We proved something today. You were right about the back end. The geometry works. It feels amazing, Keanu nodded, waiting for the but. But, Guard continued, fixing that one part has exposed the rest of the bike. Now that the rear end feels light and responsive, the front feels heavy. Now that the steering is sharp, the brakes feel spongy. We opened a can of worms here, man. To do what you want to do, to make this bike perform the way you see it in your head, we can't just modify this bike. We have to destroy it. We have to strip it down to nothing and build a completely new machine from scratch. He paused to let that sink in. And I can't do that as just a service. I can't charge you by the hour for something that is going to take 6 months of full-time work. It's not good business for me, and it's too expensive for you, even if you are a movie star. Keanu didn't look away. He didn't look at his watch or his phone. He just looked at the bike. He ran his hand along the frame again. So what are you saying? We stop here? We just leave it like this? I'm saying that the bike you want doesn't exist, Guard said, leaning back against the bench. And if you want it to exist, you can't just be a customer. You can't just write a check and come back when it's done, because I don't know exactly how to build it yet. We'd be inventing it as we go, and nobody has that kind of budget. Guard looked Keanu dead in the eye, ready to send him on his way. He expected the actor to shrug, say, thanks anyway, and go find another shop that would just take his money and give him a decent bike that wasn't perfect. That would be the normal thing to do. Instead, Keanu laughed. It was a short, determined laugh. Okay, Keanu said. So we build it from scratch. What's the problem? The problem is me, Guard said, his frustration rising a bit. I have a shop to run. I have other customers. I have a life. I can't drop everything to become your personal inventor. Then don't drop it, Keanu said simply. Let me help. I'm not working right now. I have time. I'll be your apprentice. I'll sweep the floors. I'll clean the parts. I'll do whatever needs to be done so you can focus on the design. Let's build it together. Guard stared at him. He thought this was a joke. A movie star? An apprentice? In a greasy shop in Venice? It sounded like a reality show setup. You don't know what you're asking, Guard said. This isn't acting. This is hard, dirty, boring work. It's grinding metal until your eyes burn. It's sanding aluminum for hours until your fingers go numb. It's dangerous. You'll get burned. You'll get cut. You'll ruin your clothes. I have more clothes, Keanu said with a smile. And I've been hurt before. I'm not afraid of a little work. Guard looked at Keanu's hands. They were actor's hands, mostly smooth, though he had a few calluses from riding. Guard looked at his own hands, scarred, stained permanently black with grease, nicked from years of slipping with tools. "If we do this," Guard said, his voice dropping to a serious growl, "you're not the boss. You don't tell me how to run my shop. When we're here, you're just the new guy. You do what I say. If I say sweep, you sweep. If I say hold this light, you hold it. And if you get bored or if you have to go shoot a movie, we stop. The project dies. Because I'm not holding on to a half-finished bike for you." "It's a deal," Keanu said instantly. He stuck out his hand. Guard looked at the hand, then shook it. "You're crazy," Guard muttered. "You're absolutely crazy." That handshake was the moment the project really began. It was no longer about fixing a motorcycle. It was about a partnership. It was a leap of faith for both of them. Guard was trusting a celebrity not to waste his time, and Keanu was trusting a mechanic to teach him a new craft. The next day, Keanu showed up early. He wasn't wearing a movie costume. He was wearing worn-out jeans, work boots, and a t-shirt that looked like it had seen better days. He walked in, nodded to the guys, and asked Guard what he needed to do. For the first week, Guard tested him. He gave him the worst jobs in the shop. He had Keanu cleaning parts that had been sitting on shelves for years, covered in grime. He had him sweeping the concrete floor, moving heavy boxes of tubing, and organizing the messy tool chests. It was the kind of work that usually made new hires quit within 3 days, but Keanu didn't quit. He didn't complain. He didn't pick up his phone to make calls. He just put his head down and did the work. He asked questions. "Why do we organize the wrenches like this? What is this chemical used for?" He watched the other mechanics with intense focus, trying to understand the rhythm of the shop. Slowly, the crew started to accept him. They stopped seeing the Matrix guy and started seeing Keanu, the quiet guy who worked hard and always bought lunch for the shop. The tension melted away, replaced by the camaraderie that builds in a workshop when everyone is working toward a goal. Once Keanu proved he wasn't afraid to get dirty, Guard started letting him do real work. They began the process of building the new bike from the ground up. This was a massive undertaking. They weren't buying parts out of a catalog. They were designing them. One of the biggest challenges was the frame. They needed a frame that was rigid enough to handle the power of a big V-twin engine, but flexible enough to give a comfortable ride. Guard would sketch a design on a piece of cardboard or trace it on the floor with chalk. Then, they would have to cut the steel tubes to match those lines. Keanu struggled at first with the physical tools. Welding is an art form that takes years to master. It involves using a torch that melts metal at thousands of degrees, and you have to feed a tiny filler rod into the puddle of molten metal while moving at the perfect speed. If you go too slow, you burn a hole. If you go too fast, the weld is weak. The first time Keanu tried to weld 2 pieces of tubing together, it was a mess. The metal sputtered, the smoke was thick, and the result was a lumpy, ugly scar. Guard looked at it and shook his head. "That's terrible," he said bluntly. "Try again." Keanu didn't get mad. He put the welding helmet back down and tried again. And again. And again. He spent days just practicing on scrap metal. His wrists ached. His neck hurt from looking through the darkened helmet lens. But he was determined. He wanted to understand the metal. He wanted to know why it behaved the way it did. Weeks turned into months. The shop became Keanu's sanctuary. He stopped going to Hollywood parties. He stopped reading scripts. His world shrank down to the 4 walls of the garage and the pile of parts that was slowly becoming a motorcycle. There were moments of frustration. Of course. Building something from scratch is never a straight line. One afternoon, they spent 5 hours trying to mount the engine. They fought with the mounts, trying to get the engine to sit perfectly centered in the frame. It was a puzzle that required immense patience. Finally, after sweating and swearing and straining, they got it in. It fit like a glove. They stepped back and looked at it. The raw steel frame, the blacked-out engine sitting squarely in the middle. It looked purposeful. It looked aggressive. It didn't look like a toy. It looked like a weapon. We did that, Keanu said, wiping grease off his cheek. He wasn't smiling, but there was a deep look of satisfaction in his eyes. We actually made that? Guard nodded. Yeah, we did. During this time, they developed a routine. They would work all morning, take a break to eat sandwiches sitting on crates in the alley behind the shop, and then work until it got dark. Those lunch breaks were special. They didn't talk about movies. They didn't talk about celebrities. They talked about life. They talked about the things that scared them, the things that made them happy, and the philosophy of why men create things. Guard learned that Keanu was incredibly humble. He never bragged about his success. In fact, he rarely mentioned it. He was more interested in hearing about Guard's life, about how he learned to weld, about his failures in business. Guard, in turn, saw that Keanu was incredibly sharp and thoughtful. He wasn't just an action hero. He was a thinker who was searching for something real in a world that often felt fake. There was one specific day when Keanu's phone rang nonstop for an hour. It was his agent calling about a potential movie role, a big blockbuster film that would have paid him millions of dollars. Keen. Building something from nothing is rarely as glamorous as it looks in the movies. There is no background music to swell when you make a breakthrough, and there is no clever editing to skip past the hours of boring, repetitive failure. The reality of the project in Guard Shop was that it was hard. It was exhausting. The initial excitement of the handshake and the blueprints had worn off, replaced by the gritty, day-to-day grind of fabrication. Winter turned into spring, and the weather outside the shop walls began to warm up, but inside, the temperature was always rising from the heat of the welders and the grinders. The prototype bike was no longer just a sketch or a pile of tubes. It was starting to look like a real motorcycle. But getting it to that point had required a level of patience that tested both men. One of the biggest problems they were trying to solve was the engine. They were using a massive V-twin engine, which is known for its power and its iconic sound. However, these engines are also known for shaking violently. If you ride a bike like that for an hour, your hands go numb from the vibration. Most riders just accepted this as the price of owning a powerful bike. It was just part of the experience. Keanu, however, refused to accept it. He spent hours sitting on the stationary bike in the shop, gripping the handlebars, closing his eyes, and visualizing the road. He would say, if I'm cruising at 80 miles an hour, I want to be able to see my mirrors clearly. I don't want them vibrating so much that the cars behind me look like blurry ghosts. Guard thought he was asking for the impossible. It's a big piston engine, Keanu, Guard would say, wiping oil from his hands. It shakes. That's what it does. You can't fight physics. We aren't fighting physics, Keanu would reply calmly. We are refining it. So they went to work on the vibration. They designed custom engine mounts that used a special rubber compound to absorb the shocks without making the engine feel loose. They built a custom exhaust system that balanced the pressure perfectly. It took weeks of trial and error. They would mount the engine, run it, watch it shake dangerously, and then take it apart again to adjust the mounts by a millimeter. There were days when they felt like they were getting nowhere. The shop would be filled with the sound of the engine roaring, followed by the sound of it shutting off and two men sighing in frustration, but Keanu never suggested quitting. He would just pick up a wrench and say, "Okay, let's try again." While the technical work was difficult, Keanu was fighting a different battle outside the shop walls. His agents were calling. His manager was worried. Hollywood was not used to one of its biggest stars disappearing for months to work in a garage. During this time, Keanu was offered a role in a movie that was guaranteed to be a massive hit. It was a sequel to one of his most famous action films. The offer was staggering. The money they were offering him was more than most people see in a lifetime. If he took the job, he would have to leave the shop immediately. He would have to fly to a different country for 6 months of filming. He would have to abandon the bike project halfway through. One afternoon, Keanu's phone rang continuously for an hour while he was sanding a fuel tank. The dust from the fiberglass coated his hair and his eyelashes. He finally stopped working, wiped his face, and answered the phone. He walked out into the alley behind the shop to talk. Guard watched him from the doorway. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw Keanu's body language. He saw the actor pacing back and forth. He saw Keanu rubbing his neck, looking stressed. Guard knew what was happening. The real world was pulling at him. Guard felt a pit in his stomach. He knew that any normal person would take the movie deal. It was the smart choice. It was the responsible choice. Building motorcycles was a risky hobby. Making movies was a career. Guard expected Keanu to come back in and say, "I have to go." After 20 minutes, Keanu came back inside. He put the phone in his pocket. He walked over to the workbench, picked up the sandpaper, and went back to work on the gas tank. Guard let him work for a few minutes before asking, "Well?" Keanu didn't look up. "I turned it down." Guard stopped what he was doing. "You turned down the movie? The one with the giant paycheck?" "Yeah," Keanu said simply. "If I go now, we lose the momentum? We might never finish it. And I need to finish this." Guard looked at the man in front of him. He realized that Keanu wasn't doing this for attention. He wasn't doing it to look cool. He was doing it because he believed in the machine. He was choosing the smell of gasoline and sawdust over red carpets and private jets. It was a life-changing decision, not just for his career, but for his soul. He was prioritizing his passion over his profit. In that moment, Guard's respect for him turned into something deeper. They were partners in the truest sense. With the movie deal off the table, the pace accelerated. The pressure of time was gone, replaced by a flow state. They began to focus on the aesthetics of the bike. They wanted it to look as fast as it performed. They decided to use a lot of raw, machined aluminum. Guard has a particular style where he machines the metal to have a texture that looks like it has been carved by a sculptor. It catches the light in a beautiful way. Keanu loved this look. He didn't want the bike to be painted bright colors or covered in chrome. He wanted it to look like a piece of industrial art. "No paint," Keanu said. "Let the metal speak for itself. If we make a mistake, we fix it. We don't hide it under paint." This decision made the work even harder. Paint hides scratches and imperfections. Raw aluminum shows everything. Every weld had to be perfect. Every surface had to be sanded and polished to a mirror finish. Keanu spent days just polishing parts. He would sit on a stool with a buffing wheel, spinning a piece of aluminum over and over again until it gleamed like silver. His hands would cramp up from gripping the tool, but he wouldn't stop until it was flawless. They started to assemble the bike in its final form. The chassis, the engine, the suspension, the wheels, the brakes, thousands of individual parts coming together. It was like a complicated puzzle that only the two of them understood. As the bike neared completion, the energy in the shop began to change. The mechanics working there would stop and stare at it. It didn't look like anything else on the road. It was low and sleek, but it had a muscularity that was intimidating. It looked like a predator crouching in the grass. The detailing was incredible. The foot pegs were custom machined so they wouldn't fold up in a crash. The levers were shaped to fit a human hand perfectly. The dashboard was minimal, just a simple speedometer and warning lights. Because Keanu believed that when you are riding, you should be focused on the road. Not a screen. One evening, as the sun was setting, they bolted the final piece into place. It was the gas cap. Keanu screwed it down and stepped back. They both stood there, looking at the machine. It was silent. It was just a metal object sitting in a dim garage. But it felt alive. It had a presence. "It's done," Guard whispered. "It looks like the drawing," Keanu said. "It actually looks like the drawing." They were both exhausted. Their backs ached, their hands were cut up, and they were covered in grease. But they were smiling. They had created something that the world said couldn't be created. They had blended the American cruiser style with European racing performance. They had built a bike that looked classic but handled like a fighter jet. However, as Keanu stood there looking at the bike, he felt a strange mix of emotions. He was proud, yes, but he also felt a sense of loss. The process was over. The daily struggle, the problem solving, the hours of talking with Guard, it was all done. He realized that he didn't just want the bike to be finished. He wanted the process to continue. He walked over to the bike and rested his hand on the warm engine. He thought about all the people who had told him to just buy a Harley. He thought about the industry experts who said a bike like this wasn't possible. And then he thought about the future. You know, Keanu said, breaking the silence, this isn't just for me. Guard looked at him. What do you mean? I mean, Keanu turned to look at his friend. I'm going to ride this bike. I'm going to love it. But there are other people out there like me. People who want a bike that feels like this. They don't know it exists yet, but they want it. Guard raised an eyebrow. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying, Keanu smiled, that maybe we shouldn't stop at one. Maybe we should build another one. And another one. Guard laughed, a loud, booming laugh that echoed off the walls. You're crazy. We just spent a year building one bike. Do you know how much work it was to build just one? You want to start a factory? Not a factory, Keanu corrected him gently. A workshop. Like this, but bigger. Just enough to build a few bikes a year for people who care. We can call it, I don't know. We'll think of a name. But I'm serious, Guard, we have something special here. Why should we keep it to ourselves? Guard looked back at the bike. He saw the quality of the work. He knew that there was a market for this, even if it was a small one. He looked at Keanu and saw the fire in his eyes. The actor wasn't ready to go back to movies yet. He wanted to build a legacy out of metal and oil. Guard sighed, but he was smiling. If we do this, he said, you're not just the idea guy. You're going to be the CEO. You're going to have to do the boring stuff too. Taxes, paperwork, meetings. I can do boring stuff, Keanu said. As long as I still get to come to the shop? Guard shook his head. The morning of the final test ride was crisp and clear. The kind of California day where the sky looks like it has been scrubbed clean. Inside the shop, the air was thick with a mix of nervous energy and anticipation. The motorcycle, which they had come to call the KRGT-1, sat in the center of the room. It was no longer a collection of parts or a rough prototype. It was a finished machine gleaming under the shop lights. The raw aluminum bodywork looked like liquid silver, and the blacked-out engine sat in the frame like a heart waiting to beat. Keanu stood by the workbench, putting on his riding gear. He pulled on his leather jacket, zipped it up, and tugged on his gloves. He moved slowly, taking his time. This wasn't just a test drive. It was the verdict on a year of his life. Guard stood nearby, holding his helmet. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The look on his face said everything. He was proud, but he was also worried. Building a bike in a garage is one thing. Making it work on the open road is something else entirely. There are 1,000 things that can go wrong when you leave the safety of the shop. You ready? Guard asked, handing Keanu the helmet. As I'll ever be, Keanu replied. He took the helmet and pulled it on, his face disappearing behind the dark visor. He swung his leg over the bike and settled onto the seat. Even sitting still, the bike looked right. It looked balanced. He reached down and turned the key. The fuel pump whined for a second, priming the system. Then he hit the starter. The engine roared to life, a deep, thundering sound that shook the floorboards of the shop. But it wasn't a chaotic shake. It was a controlled, rhythmic pulse. Guard watched the handlebars. They didn't vibrate. The mirrors were steady. It was a small sign, but it was a good one. Keanu blipped the throttle, listening to the engine rev up and down. He nodded his head once. He kicked the bike into gear, released the clutch, and rolled out of the garage and into the sunlight. Guard and the rest of the crew walked outside and watched him go. Keanu didn't ride fast at first. He was easy on the throttle, getting a feel for the suspension and the brakes as he navigated the city streets. He turned a corner and disappeared from view. Guard checked his watch. The waiting game began. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. The crew started to get restless. Maybe he broke down, one of the mechanics joked, though he didn't really mean it. Guard just leaned against the door, his arms crossed, refusing to believe anything bad happened. Finally, they heard it. The distinctive sound of the KRGT-1 echoing off the buildings down the street. It was coming back, and it was coming back fast. Keanu flew into view, leaning hard into a turn before straightening up and accelerating up the street in front of the shop. He didn't just drive by, he pushed the bike. He went through the gears, the engine screaming as he accelerated past the shop at a serious speed. He looked like he was glued to the machine. The bike tracked perfectly straight. It looked stable, agile, and incredibly fast. He braked hard at the end of the street, turned the bike around in a smooth U-turn, and roared back toward them. This time, he pulled right into the driveway and skidded to a stop in a cloud of dust. The engine idled smoothly, ticking as it cooled down. Keanu killed the engine and sat there for a moment, motionless. Then he flipped up the visor of his helmet. He was grinning so wide it looked like his face might hurt. He was sweating and his eyes were bright with adrenaline. "Well?" Guard asked, trying to sound cool but failing to hide his own smile. Keanu took off his helmet and shook his head. "It's alive, Guard. It's absolutely alive. The power, it's instant. And the handling, it turns like it's reading my mind. We did it. It actually works." Guard let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for a year. "Let me take it." They swapped places. Guard went out for his own test ride. When he came back, he was just as excited. They had done it. They hadn't just built a custom bike that looked cool. They had built a performance machine that could rival the best motorcycles in the world. Over the next few weeks, they didn't keep the bike hidden. They rode it everywhere. They wanted to see how it handled in real traffic on highways and on winding canyon roads. Everywhere they went, the bike turned heads. It sounded incredible, and it looked like nothing else on the road, but the most surprising thing was the reaction of other riders. Usually when you ride a custom bike, other bikers might nod or wave, but they keep their distance. They assume it's a show bike, something that is too expensive or too fragile to be ridden hard. But this bike was different. It looked aggressive. It looked functional. One afternoon, Keanu and Guard stopped at a popular motorcycle hangout spot along the coast. They parked the KRGT-1 and went to get a cup of coffee. When they came back, there was a crowd gathered around the bike. People were pointing at the suspension, looking at the machining, and taking pictures. A guy, who looked like a serious rider, walked up to them. He looked at Keanu, then at Guard. "Is this yours?" he asked. Guard nodded. "Yeah, we built it." The guy shook his head in disbelief. "I've been riding for 30 years. I've owned Ducatis, I've owned Harleys, I've owned Japanese superbikes. I have never seen anything like this. The fit and finish. It's beautiful. And the stance of it? It looks like it means business." He paused for a second, looking Keanu in the eye. "Where can I buy one?" Guard and Keanu looked at each other. It was a question they hadn't really figured out how to answer yet. "It's a prototype," Guard said. "We only built one." "Well," the rider said, "if you ever decide to make more, put my name on the list. I'll write you a check right now." He walked away, but his words hung in the air. Over the next few weeks, it happened again and again. At gas stations, at stoplights, at bike nights, people didn't just compliment the bike. They wanted to own it. They wanted that feeling. They saw the passion in the details. One evening, Keanu and Guard were sitting on the floor of the shop, eating pizza and looking at the bike. It was late, and the shop was quiet. "He was the 5th guy this week to ask where they can buy one," Keanu said, taking a slice of pizza. "The guy at the stoplight today offered to trade me his car for it." Guard laughed. "He offered to trade his car? Which car? Some sports car?" "I didn't really look. I wasn't interested." Guard wiped his mouth with a napkin and grew serious. He looked around the shop. He looked at the tools, the jigs they had built, the scraps of metal on the floor. He thought about the year they had just spent. The blood, the sweat, the arguments, and the ultimate victory. He thought about how happy he was making this bike. "You know," Guard said slowly, "we could do it. We could actually do it." Keanu looked at him. "Do what?" "Start a company," Guard said. "Not just a shop?" A real motorcycle company. We build this bike. We sell it. We build another one. We don't have to build millions of them. We don't have to be Harley Davidson. We just need to build enough for the people who get it. The people who want something real. Keanu set his pizza down. It was a massive idea. It was one thing to spend a year and a lot of money building one dream machine for yourself. It was another thing entirely to turn that into a business. It meant manufacturing. It meant suppliers. It meant quality control. It meant hiring more people. It meant investing millions of dollars. "I'm in," Keanu said without a second of hesitation. "If you're in, I'm in." "You realize this isn't going to be like a movie, right?" Guard warned him. "There's no director to yell cut. If we do this, it's real. If the bike breaks, the customer is angry. If we run out of money, we lose everything." "I know," Keanu said. "That's why I want to do it. This is tangible. This is real. I make movies, and sometimes they disappear after a few weeks. But this is steel. This is aluminum. This will be here forever. I want to build something that lasts." They sat there for a long time talking about the future. They decided on a name that night. They would call it Arch Motorcycle. An arch is strong. It supports weight. It bridges a gap. It felt right. It felt like the bridge they had built between the American cruiser and the European sport bike. The decision was made. Keanu wrote the checks. He invested a significant amount of his own money to get the company off the ground. He wasn't just a celebrity endorser. He was the co-founder. He was in the meetings with the parts suppliers. He was on the factory floor learning how to run a business. This was the life-changing decision the story started with. It wasn't a sudden impulse. It was a slow burn that started with a single observation about a sissy bar being too heavy. That observation led to a curiosity. That curiosity led to a partnership. That partnership led to a prototype. And the love for that prototype led to a business. Keanu Reeves could have easily gone back to making movies and writing expensive motorcycles that other people built. He could have stayed a passenger in the automotive industry. But by choosing to start Arch Motorcycle, he took the wheel. He became a creator. He challenged himself to learn a new language, the language of manufacturing and business. Years later, Arch Motorcycle would become a respected name in the industry, known for producing some of the most advanced and beautiful custom production motorcycles in the world. But it all started because one man refused to accept that things had to be the way they were. He saw a problem, he opened his mouth, and he put in the work. As they turned off the lights in the shop that night, leaving the KRGT1 sitting alone in the dark, it wasn't just a motorcycle anymore. It was a symbol. It